Chapter 1: The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. The Door. It is often said that Mr. Utterson was very quiet for a lawyer. He was happier listening to others talk than talking himself. He did not brag or boast about his work. He did not spend too much time thinking about himself. Quite simply, he was a rare and admired man. His clients were the misfits of society. They were people who often lived and worked on the wrong side of the law. Mr. Utterson always minded his own business and kept his distance, though. He merely did his job. He prepared wills and arranged finances and turned a blind eye to everyone else. He was careful never to get involved. Mr. Utterson was a man of order and routine. He never seemed to do anything even remotely exciting. In fact, he felt quite uneasy if anything was out of place. His schedule was set, and he did not like the idea of change. He loved the theater, but he had not gone in over 20 years. He loved bridge, but he never played. The truth was that many people considered Mr. Utterson to be dreary, dusty, and cold. Yet Mr. Utterson was a well-loved man. His friends saw a different side to him. They saw a special spark in his eye. They knew him to be a kind, concerned, and caring man. He was a favorite guest at dinner parties. He could always be counted on to listen to problems and offer wise advice. He was considered a dear, trusted friend by anyone who knew him. Mr. Utterson's friends were relatives or men that he had known for many, many years. He did not look outside his small circle for new friends. They suited his need for order and structure. So each and every Sunday, Mr. Utterson joined his cousin, Mr. Enfield, for a walk. They had been meeting for their Sunday walks for many years. So many, in fact, they had lost count. They must have looked a strange pair to all who passed them. The two men spoke very little while walking side by side. They walked in silence, hands in pockets, each swinging walking sticks by their side. When they happened to see a friend along the way, they seemed overjoyed for the distraction. They always urged the friend to join them on their journey. Looks can be deceiving, however. The men enjoyed their Sunday walks a great deal and refused to let anything delay them. It was on one of their walks that Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield found themselves in a busy section of London. People filled the streets. Everyone, it seemed, was enjoying the sunny day. Mr. Utterson and his cousin turned down a quiet side street. Normally, this street was full of people, but the shops were closed on Sunday. Therefore, the two men had the street almost to themselves. Unlike the rest of the neighborhood, which was run down, the residents and buildings along the street were doing well. The buildings were neat and clean and freshly painted shutters and well-polished brass details. Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield admired the houses and shops as they walked past. 2 doors from the end of the block stood a building different from the rest. It had a battered doorway leading into a courtyard. The paint on the door was chipped, and the latch looked about to fall off. The building was 2 stories high. From what they could see from the street, it was in complete disrepair. The building looked neglected and abandoned. There were no windows on the wall facing the 2 men, only the door without a bell or a knocker. They were standing across the street from the building. Mr. Enfield lifted his cane and pointed. "Have you ever noticed that door?" he asked his cousin. Mr. Utterson answered that he had. "It always makes me remember a very odd story," Mr. Enfield continued. "Really?" said Mr. Utterson. "And what was that?" He looked at his cousin. Mr. Enfield was deep in thought. Chapter 2: Enfield's Story. After some time, Mr. Enfield replied, "Well, it was this way. I was walking home very late one night. The path I took was completely empty. I saw no one for many blocks. The fog had set in, so there was no moonlight, only the streetlights to keep me company. I'll admit that I felt a bit scared. It's odd to be the only human in a dark and lonely area. At least, I thought I was the only person out that night. Quite suddenly, I saw 2 other figures on the street. One was a man walking away from me. He was rather short and stooped over. I was surprised by his speed. He moved very quickly and with a clear purpose. The other was a little girl about 8 or 9 years old. She was running along the cross street. Naturally, the 2 ran into each other as the girl turned around the corner. The man knocked the girl down. It was horrible. He did not stop. He stepped on her leg and continued on his way. He barely seemed to even notice her. The poor girl lay crying in the street, and the man did not stop or even look her way. I realize that my description doesn't sound like much, but it was horrible to see. His actions were so cold. I yelled at the man and ran after him. I caught up with him quite as easily and grabbed his arm. He did not resist as I brought him back to the screaming child. Actually, he looked perfectly calm. He wasn't the least bit bothered by his actions. Just then, the man gave me a look so ugly that I began to sweat. It was as though I had just finished exercising. The girl's family rushed outside. She had been returning from going to get the doctor when the man knocked her over. Thankfully, the doctor wasn't far behind her in the street. He attended to the screaming child at once. He said she was more frightened than hurt. In any other circumstances, that might have been the end of it. But I had taken such a disliking to the strange fellow that I couldn't let it go. I wasn't alone in this feeling either. The girl's family was similarly horrified, of course, but it was the doctor's reaction that struck me the most. Whenever he looked at the man, the doctor grew sick and white with anger and hatred. At first, I thought he recognized the strange man, but I don't think that was the case. There was something about the man that caused so strong a reaction. Looking into this villain's face made you feel so uncomfortable that you wanted to turn away instantly. His eyes were lifeless and cold. His mouth was twisted into a cruel smile. I can only describe what I felt as horror. It was quite unusual. "What did you do?" Mr. Utterson asked. "Did you call the police?" Mr. Utterson was gripped by the story. He needed to hear the ending. How was this strange man connected with the battered door across the street from them? "We tried a different tactic," Mr. Enfield continued. "We told this man that he would spread the story of his cruel deed throughout London. Everyone would be talking about it. We warned him that if he had any friends or business, he would soon lose them. I expected this man to be sorry, but he seemed little affected by our comments. "If you choose to make such a fuss about the incident," he said to me coldly, "then I have no choice but to obey your demands. After all, no gentleman wants to make a scene." His voice was so calm that it gave me shivers, and then this man actually smiled. It was an awful, sinister smile. "Name your price," he said. With very little argument, the strange man agreed to pay the girl's family £100. The doctor and I agreed to stay with the man and get the money. We followed him to the door, this very door that stands across from you and me right now, where he disappeared for a few minutes. He came back outside with a check for £100. I examined it. I was shocked by the name on the check. It was the name of a well-known and upstanding citizen. Clearly, the strange man had forged a signature or obtained it by unlawful means. "Set your mind at rest," the man sneered. "I will stay with you until morning and cash the check myself. You see it's good." So the doctor, the strange man, and I returned to my house, where we waited until the banks opened. It was very uncomfortable. None of us spoke. The doctor and I watched this man with great curiosity. He stared into the fireplace the whole time. Finally, morning arrived and we set out for the bank. I told the teller that I had every reason to believe that the check was fake. I was shocked to learn that it was real. "Tut," Mr. Utterson replied. He shook his head. "I can see you feel the same as I do," Mr. Enfield said. "Yes, it is a sad story. The strange man that I met was a truly awful fellow, someone that you would never want to meet. He was frightening and evil." Mr. Enfield shook his head sadly. "And the man whose name was on the check was a man of merit and good standing in society. I cannot imagine what brought the two of them together. Since that night, I have referred to this building as the Blackmail House. I can only assume that the strange and wicked man holds some secret over the gentleman." Mr. Enfield drifted off into his own thoughts. "And do you know," Mr. Utterson said, "if the gentleman who wrote the check actually lives in this building?" "I believe he lives somewhere in Soho district," Mr. Enfield said absentmindedly. "I've watched this door from time to time," he continued. "It barely seems like a house at all. There are no windows on this side. No one comes in or goes out except occasionally that man. I've caught a few glimpses through the door and noticed that there are 3 windows facing the inner courtyard that are kept clean. There's often smoke from the chimney, so someone must live there." As the two men continued their walk, Mr. Utterson was deep in thought. "Enfield," he said, "would you mind telling me the name of the man who knocked the child down?" "Well," said Enfield, "I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man by the name of Hyde, Edward Hyde." Utterson took a deep breath. He recognized the name. "Ah, I see," he said. "Could you describe him to me?" "As I said, he's not easy to describe," Enfield replied. "There was something unusual about him, something disturbing. I want to say horrible. I reacted with such strong dislike at the sight of him, yet I don't know why. His clothes were baggy and too big for him. He wore a tall hat and a cape. He had a slight hunch. On second thought, I don't think it can describe him. It's not that I forget what it looks like, I simply don't have the words. Are you certain that he used a key to get in the building? Utterson asked. Of course, Enfield said. I know my questions must seem strange, said Utterson. The fact is, I don't need to ask the name of the other party because I already know it. You see, Enfield, the name Hyde is quite familiar to me. I cannot offer any details, but I can tell you he is linked to a document I am preparing for a dear friend of mine, Dr. Henry Jekyll. If you told any lie or exaggeration during this story, please tell me. I must know all the facts. Every word I've said is true, said Enfield. He was slightly hurt that his cousin doubted him. He was not used to people, especially his cousin, questioning him. Hyde had a key to the building, and what's more, he still has it. I saw him use it not a week ago. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but said not a word. He was thinking about that battered doorway and the courtyard beyond it. He had already had concerns about this man, Hyde. He now knew that he could not ignore this mystery any longer. Unfortunately, he had no idea what he should do next. Utterson, Enfield said, I'm sorry I mentioned Hyde or the story. Let us promise never to discuss it again. He put his hands on his cousin's shoulder. It was clear that Utterson was very upset by the news. Enfield wanted to hear Utterson's story about Hyde, but he knew how much his cousin respected other people's privacy. Utterson would never reveal someone else's secret. With all my heart, the lawyer said. He was relieved that Enfield asked no more questions. Let's shake hands on the matter and leave it. The two cousins shook hands and continued on their walk. They spent the rest of their time together in silence. Chapter 3. A Conversation with Dr. Lanyon. It was Mr. Utterson's custom on Sunday nights to enjoy a good book by the fire and be in bed by midnight. On this night, however, Utterson sat down to dinner in bad spirits. He had too much on his mind and had a touch of indigestion. As soon as his plate was taken away, he went to his den. He opened his safe and removed some private papers. The last will and testament of Dr. Henry Jekyll was written on the envelope. Mr. Utterson opened it and sat down. His brow was furrowed. Utterson was not pleased with the terms of the will. As a matter of fact, he had argued with Jekyll about its contents. The will stated that upon the death of Dr. Jekyll, or disappearance of longer than 3 months, of all the doctor's possessions and money should go to Mr. Edward Hyde. The lawyer thought it was highly unusual for Jekyll to leave his entire fortune to one man. Utterson was one of Jekyll's closest friends, but he had known nothing about Mr. Hyde until Enfield mentioned him. Utterson was most disturbed by the phrase, or a disappearance of longer than 3 months. Why on earth would anyone include such a statement in his will? Did Dr. Jekyll think he might disappear? Utterson thought this was madness, but Jekyll had only laughed at him. There was nothing the lawyer could do but honor his friend's wishes. Now, however, Utterson was outraged to learn that the man Hyde was, in fact, a monster. Why would his good friend Jekyll be involved with such a man? With a heavy heart and a great deal of worry for his friend, he put the papers back in the safe. Utterson could not think of going to sleep in such a state. He put on his coat and left for Cavendish Square, where his friend Dr. Lanyon lived. If anyone knows about this man Hyde, Utterson thought, it will be Lanyon. Lanyon, Jekyll, and Utterson had known each other since they were young. There was a time when they were inseparable. Many years had passed, though, and the old friends rarely saw one another. Lanyon and Jekyll, in particular, had gone their separate ways. Utterson knocked on Dr. Lanyon's door. Dr. Lanyon greeted his old friend with a hearty welcome. It's been too long, Utterson, he said. Where have you been keeping yourself? Lanyon was a healthy, lively man with a reddish face and stark white hair. His house was well decorated and with comfortable couches and chairs. Every room felt warm and welcoming. There was always a roaring fire and plenty of candlelight. Lanyon enjoyed company and long conversations with friends. He had a loud, booming laugh that often heard echoing around the house. They talked for a while about old times and what had happened since they last talked. Utterson said that his law practice was going well. Lanyon spoke of some of his patients and said that he was looking forward to retirement. Eventually, the lawyer brought up the reason for his late visit. I suppose, Lanyon, he said, that you must You and I must be Dr. Jekyll's two oldest friends." "I wish we were younger friends," chuckled Dr. Lanyon. "But I suppose we are, and what about it? I see little of him now." "Really?" Utterson said. "I thought you had a lot of common interests. As doctors, the two of you always had so much to discuss." "We had," came the reply. "But it's more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too strange for me. He began to go wrong, terribly wrong in my opinion. He had very odd and unscientific notions. Not only do I think that his ideas and experiments were unscientific, I believe they were unethical. He was moving toward very dangerous results. I simply could not continue to support him. Of course, as an old friend, I am still concerned for his well-being, but I wanted little to do with him." It was upsetting to hear that Lanyon and Jekyll had a fight. He wanted to ask about these dangerous experiments, but Utterson knew he should stick to the topic he really wanted to talk about. "Did you ever come across a man known as Mr. Hyde?" Utterson asked. "Hyde," repeated Landon. "No, I've never heard of him." Utterson was disappointed. He had hoped Lanyon would be able to provide a clue to the connection. The lawyer had seen little of Jekyll in the past few months. It was disturbing to know that Lanyon saw even less of him. Utterson returned home shortly after this conversation and went to bed. It was not a restful sleep, though. The lawyer tossed and turned all night. He could not take his mind off Jekyll and this man Hyde. Was this criminal blackmailing his old friend? Enfield called in the blackmail house, and perhaps he was right. Was there something in Jekyll's past that he wanted to hide? Utterson thought this might be the truth. The doctor's youth had not been ideal. He had engaged in many wild activities. Utterson had warned his friend to be careful, but Jekyll had only laughed. The young doctor thought that no harm could come from a few adventures. Not many years later, Jekyll was being blackmailed by this mysterious man. It pained the lawyer to think of his old friend awoken in the middle of the night by this monster Hyde, demanding a check for £100. And worse still, Jekyll had been persuaded to leave all his worldly goods to the blackmailer Hyde. Utterson worried for the safety of his old friend. He decided he must meet Hyde face to face. Chapter 4. The Search for Mr. Hyde. For some time after, Utterson visited the doorway where Enfield had told his story. He stopped by in the morning before heading to work. He visited over lunch hours when the street was busy with shoppers. At night, when no one was around, the lawyer waited and watched. If he is Mr. Hyde, Utterson thought, then I shall be Mr. Seek. At long last, his patience was rewarded. It was a clear, dry night with a bright full moon lighting up the street. There was no fog or rain. All of the shops were closed and the street was very quiet. Standing in a doorway, Utterson heard light, quick footsteps approaching. Before he even saw the dark figure turn the corner, Utterson knew it was Mr. Hyde. Hyde was a small man. He wore casual clothes and a dark coat. His hat was pulled down low on his head. Utterson thought for a moment that Hyde was limping, but it was only his eyes playing tricks on him. Hyde had a strong, forceful walk. He walked straight to the door, pulling out his key as he crossed the street. He did not look like a burglar, or as if he was sneaking into the building. He looked comfortable. Hyde looked very much like a man going into his own home. Mr. Utterson stepped out of the shadows and touched Mr. Hyde's shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I presume," Utterson said. Hyde shrank back with a hissing gasp. He was only startled for a moment, though. He appeared calm, but he did not look the lawyer in the face as he answered. "That's my name. What do you want?" he said. "I'm an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's," the lawyer said. "My name is Utterson. I'm sure you have heard of me. It is a coincidence to run into you out here," Mr. Utterson lied. "I wondered if you would let me inside the house." "How do you know me?" Mr. Hyde asked. He still refused to look at Utterson in the face. He looked down at the street or toward the door, but not directly at the man standing in front of him. "May I ask you a favor?" Utterson said. He ignored Hyde's question. The lawyer thought it best to get straight to the point. Also, he felt a strong dislike and discomfort that Enfield mentioned. Something about Hyde brought this reaction. "Of course," Hyde answered. "What shall it be?" "Allow me to see your face," the lawyer said. Hyde appeared to hesitate. Then, after a moment or two of thought, he boldly looked the lawyer in the eyes. They stared at each other for several seconds. "Now I shall know your face when we meet again," Utterson said. "It may be useful." Utterson spoke with a confident voice. "Yeah," returned Hyde. "It is as good we have met." Hyde spoke confidently as well. The two men stood face to face, almost daring the other to look away first. It might be best if you have my address, too, Hyde added. He handed Utterson a card. It listed in Anderson, Soho, a more dangerous part of the city. My word, Utterson thought to himself, could he be giving me his address because of the will? Utterson worried about his friend Jekyll. Did Hyde hope to collect his inheritance soon? He kept his feelings to himself, though, and thanked Hyde for the card. And now, Hyde said, how do you know me? By description, came the plan. Whose description? We have common friends, Utterson said. Common friends? Hyde asked. Who are they? Well, Dr. Jekyll, for instance, said Utterson. Hyde broke out into an awful, ugly laugh. His eyes were cold and dark. They did not sparkle or light up as he laughed. There was no joy. In the next moment, with amazing quickness, Hyde unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. Chapter 5. Dr. Jekyll's Home. The lawyer stood for a while by the door. He looked very uncomfortable. As he walked slowly away, he was lost in thought. Utterson said to himself, holy moly, he seemed barely human. Utterson continued around the corner to the other side of the block. Most of the buildings on the street were divided up into apartments or offices. At one time, this neighborhood had been home to large, wealthy families. Many of these families had owned entire buildings. Only one house still had a single owner. That was the second house from the corner. It was the last to show signs of wealth and comfort. The front door was newly painted. The knocker was polished and shiny, and the other buildings had dirty windows and broken gates. But this building was well taken care of and clean. Utterson climbed its front steps and knocked. A well-dressed butler answered the door. Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole? Asked the lawyer. I will see, Mr. Utterson, Poole said. The butler let Mr. Utterson inside and then went to look for his master. Utterson waited in a large, comfortable room warmed by bright, open fire. This was one of the lawyer's favorite places in all of London. The room was decorated in dark, rich colors. The drapes were made of deep red velvet. The floors were covered in hand-woven Persian rugs. The walls were lined with expensive artwork and well-stocked bookshelves. He and Jekyll had spent many evenings here in quiet, enjoyable conversation. Utterson's mood that night, however, was neither welcoming nor warm. He could not forget the face of the monster Mr. Hyde. Poole returned with the news that Dr. Jekyll was not at home. I am afraid I don't know when he will return, sir, Poole said. He may be out for the rest of the evening. I saw Mr. Hyde entering this building from around the corner, Poole, through the door by the old laboratory, Utterson said. Is that a good idea when Dr. Jekyll is away from home? Mr. Hyde has a key, the servant replied. Your master seems to place a great deal of trust in Mr. Hyde, the lawyer said. Yes, sir, he does indeed, said Poole. We all have orders to obey him, although we see very little of Mr. Hyde on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes in the laboratory. Dr. Jekyll had brought the house many, many years before from another doctor. The previous owner had built a laboratory in the back of the house. The lab was a large room with a high ceiling and shelves and cabinets lining the wall. There were no windows in the room, only lamps and lanterns along the walls. There was an office above the lab where Dr. Jekyll could sit and work quietly. The office was much more welcoming than the lab. It had a fireplace, some comfortable chairs, and a window facing the main house. There was a courtyard separating the two buildings. Dr. Jekyll had not changed a thing in the lab. It was the main reason he bought the house. The cabinets and the equipment were almost antiques, but Jekyll liked them. He often spoke about his desire to surround himself with beautiful things. It was important at home and at work. Well, thank you for your time, Poole, Utterson said. He wondered what Poole really thought of Mr. Hyde. The butler was always very polite. He would certainly never say anything bad about Dr. Jekyll. Utterson knew that Poole was very loyal to his master. As a matter of fact, all of Jekyll's servants were very loyal to him. He was considered a kind and fair man by all who met him. Please tell Dr. Jekyll that I stopped by. Of course, sir, Poole said. The butler saw Mr. Utterson to the front door. There was a cool wind. Utterson held on to his hat and with one hand while he walked along the street. He was deep in thought. The lawyer was familiar with the less desirable members of society because many were his clients. He was aware of crime in the city and criminals who committed these acts, but he was very careful to never bring them into his life. His work was his work. He did not let it affect his personal life. He could never imagine bringing a criminal into his home. Utterson could not understand why Jekyll would let this dangerous man into his house. Perhaps his friend did not know anything about Hyde running down the little girl. Maybe Jekyll did not realize the danger he was in. Sadly, Mr. Utterson knew that this was not true. He knew that in his heart that Jekyll was aware of Hyde's unlawful activities. By this time, the lawyer was very worried about his old friend and his connection to Mr. Hyde. It must be the ghost of some old sin that holds Jekyll prisoner. Why else would he deal with the likes of Mr. Hyde? Jekyll's family was very wealthy. He had always lived in a life of luxury, despite his studies and experiments. He only worked because he enjoyed science. Utterson wondered about how his own youth, if there was anything he might want hidden. He could think of nothing that would bring him such shame or fault. Utterson also worried that if Hyde knew of Jekyll's will, that he was to inherit all the doctor's great wealth, he might do something to speed up the process. If only Jekyll would let me help. Utterson shook his head. The mystery was far from being resolved. Chapter 6. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. 2 weeks later, Dr. Jekyll gave a dinner party for a small group of old and dear friends. Mr. Utterson was among the guests, of course. Utterson was a well-loved guest at any dinner party. He was especially welcome at the end of the evening. Host enjoyed his dry wit and careful manner. The lawyer provided a calm break after a talkative dinner party. On the night in particular, Utterson made certain to stay after the others. He waited by the fire until everyone had left. Dr. Jekyll took a seat across Utterson. He was a large, fit, smooth-faced man of 50. He used to lead conversations and discussions in a lively manner. Lately, however, he preferred to listen quietly. Over the past year or so, Jekyll had grown more distant. He was colder and more removed. Some thought he appeared judgmental. They criticized him whenever he was not at a social function or dinner party. As a result, Jekyll became less and less social. His friends often remarked how rarely they saw him. There was a time when they had seen each other each week, but now several months often passed without seeing the doctor. On this night, however, he seemed like his old self. He had a relaxed smile across his face while talking to Utterson. They sat drinking their tea before the fireplace. "I have been wanting to speak to you, Jekyll," Utterson began. "You know that will of yours." "Poor Mr. Utterson," Jekyll said. "I never saw anyone so as distressed as you when you saw that will, except our good friend Lanyon when he spoke out against my unscientific theories. Or should I say that what he called my unscientific theories. He's an excellent fellow, but I've never been more disappointed in a man." "You know, I never approved of the will," Utterson continued. He chose to ignore Jekyll's change of topic. "My will? Well, yes, certainly, I realize that." The doctor spoke a bit sharply. The lawyer was surprised by Jekyll's angry response. "You told me so." "Well, I'll tell you so again," said the lawyer. He was determined to have this talk with Jekyll. It was far too important. "I've been learning something of that Mr. Hyde." The large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale. "I do not care to hear more," he said. "This is a matter I thought we had agreed to drop." "What I heard was awful," Utterson said. He felt uncomfortable prying into Jekyll's business. That was not something he would normally do. Utterson was a popular lawyer among certain members of society because he did not ask too many questions. He did his job without digging too deeply into his clients' lives and actions. Jekyll was more than a client, though. He was Utterson's oldest and dearest friend. The lawyer knew that he must pursue the topic of Hyde, or he would never forgive himself. "I will not change my mind. You do not understand my position," returned the doctor. "My situation is very strange indeed." "Jekyll," Utterson said, "you know me. I'm a man to be trusted. Make a clean break of this business and tell me everything." "My dear Utterson," Jekyll said, "this is a very, very good of you, and I cannot thank you enough for your generosity. I trust you more than any man alive, even before myself, but I have no choice in the matter. I'll put your mind at ease, though. I can be rid of Hyde whenever I choose." Jekyll sat straight up in his chair. He looked at his friend in the eye. The force of his stare seemed familiar to the lawyer. Utterson wondered where he had seen it before. "If you can be rid of Hyde at any moment," Utterson said, leaning forward in his chair, "then I beg you to do so now." He tried to keep his voice calm, but it was hard to hide his concern. Please, Jekyll, you must end your relationship with Hyde. I thank you for your concern, but remember that this is a private matter. Please let it go, Jekyll said. Utterson turned his gaze into the fire. He thought for a moment. I have no doubt you are perfectly right, he said at last. Utterson decided there was nothing he could do. He would have to trust his friend in this matter. He stood up to walk away. There is one point that I hope you understand, Jekyll added. I have a great interest in Hyde, a very great interest. He told me that you met him near the laboratory the other week. I fear that he was rude to you. I am very sorry for that. He is a difficult man, I know, but I need your word that you will honor the terms of the will. If I should die or disappear, please see that Hyde receives what is rightly his. It would be a weight off my mind if you promised. I can't pretend that I shall ever like him, Utterson said. The lawyer wondered if he would ever get his friend back. He wondered if Jekyll was now lost to this man Hyde. I don't ask that, Jekyll pleaded. I only ask for justice. I only ask you to help him for my sake when I'm no longer here. Utterson heaved a big sigh. I promise.